Welcome back everyone to this lecture on the as clause. Before we learn about joins, let's quickly cover this as clause or as statement, which allows us to create an alias for a column or result. And what we mean by alias is just an alternative name. Let's see the example syntax for this. This is actually quite simple. Instead of just selecting a column from a table, we say select column as, and then we decide on a new name to display in the data output. We can also use this on functions on a column. So we can say something like select column and then have that, instead of displaying as sum of that column in the data output, instead have it display as new name. Let's see some examples. So this is the way it classically works, where we say select customer ID from payment. And notice that the column name is the same in the data output below. We see customer underscore ID. Now let's see what happens if we were to use the as statement. So here we're saying select amount as rental price from payment. So notice here, instead of having the output reported as the amount column, instead we decided to give it an alias or rename it as rental underscore price. And maybe this will be easier for some other analysts to read when we actually show them our SQL query results. So really here, it's just for readability on the data output. And this starts to make sense, especially when we perform functions on a column. For example, select sum amount as net revenue from payment. And instead of having the output just say sum of the amount, here we can clarify it with an alias as the total net revenue from the payment table. So essentially, in net revenue, we've made around $61,312. Now keep in mind, the as operator gets executed at the very end of a query. And this is where a lot of students, especially beginners, get confused. That means that we cannot use the alias inside of something like a where operator or a group by call. And I'm going to walk through an example of trying to do that and having it show an error, because a lot of students get confused on that particular notion. You essentially only get to use that alias in the select statement. Anywhere else, it's not actually going to be valid. So let's head over to pgadmin and walk through an example of that. Okay, here I am at my query editor. What I'm going to do is say select, and we're actually going to say count the amount from the payment column. So if I run this, notice I get back just count as my output. And if I just see this data output without any regards to the query, it's pretty unclear what this is actually counting. So maybe I want to clarify this using an alias. So I can say as, and counting the amount from the payment column is the same as asking how many transactions have occurred. So I can say number of transactions, run this, and now I see that the data output has been renamed to be num underscore transactions. And recall, with count, you can always just pass in anything here, such as an asterisk, and that will be the exact same thing. So here, saying count asterisk as num transactions from payment, using this alias, it makes it quite clear what the data output is actually showing us. Okay. Now let's imagine we were going to do a group by statement. So let's do the following. Let's say select the customer ID and then sum amount from payments, and then I'm going to group by customer ID, essentially showing how much each customer actually has spent. So I run this and I get back the customer ID as well as some sum. However, if I'm looking at the data output, maybe it's not super clear that this sum happens to be their actual expenditure, because I don't see a dollar sign here anywhere. And unless I actually get to read this query and understand the thought process behind it, the data output results don't specifically tell me that this sum happens to be their total spent. So I can simply say as total spent, and notice I do this directly after whatever column or function result I want to rename. And then I run this, and I get back here in the data output total spent. Now, here is where I really want you to focus, because this is where beginners often make a mistake. Let's imagine that I wanted to clarify on the sum amount. We already know I can do something like this. Having sum amount, and let's have it be greater than 100. And we actually did pretty much this exact same query, and I'm going to remove as total spent. So what am I doing here? I'm doing the exact same thing as before, except after I've done the group by and calculated the sum amount, I'm going to do an additional filtering using having, where sum amount is greater than 100. So I run this, and notice now my sums are all greater than 100. And now I'm going to use, again, my alias to just clarify that as total spent. So I run this, and now I get to see total spent here. Unfortunately, this alias gets assigned at the very end, which means I cannot do this. And this is where beginners try to do this a lot. They'll say having total spent greater than 100. And if they run this, you get back an error. It'll say column total spent does not exist, which at this stage is true. Total spent is only going to exist at the very end at the data output. So because an alias gets assigned at the very end, you cannot use it in something like a where statement or a having clause. Unfortunately, you have to go back and choose the original either column name or the original function. So we'll have to say having some amount greater than 100, and we see back these results. So keep that in mind. These aliases get assigned at the very end, so you can't use them to filter by. So I'm going to show you another example of this. Let's just go ahead and remove group by and having some, and we'll just say amount. We run this. So here are all the customer IDs. Notice there's repeats as well as the amounts. Now let's imagine I wanted to qualify this for amounts greater than $2. Well, I could say from payment, then where amount is greater than 2. So I run this, and now notice I got rid of all those 199 transactions. Now, if I happen to use an alias on amounts, so we'll say as new name, I run this, notice new name is now in the data output. Unfortunately, I cannot do this. I cannot say where new name is greater than 2. If I run this, I get the same error as before, that new name does not exist. So again, just to clarify, these aliases get assigned at the end, and unfortunately, you can't use them in the where clause or the having clause to filter by. Instead, just think of them as being used in the data output. And you'll have to use the original column name if you plan to do any filtering or comparison operations on it. All right, that's it for the as statement. As you can imagine, as we begin to join tables using join statements, it'll become quite useful to be able to assign aliases for clarification. Okay, coming up next, we'll begin discussing joins. I'll see you there.